Well, my late father was a prolific reader. He didn't have a lot of spare time. He was a veterinarian, owned his own practice, took care of my mom and my sister and me. And he didn't hunt, he didn't fish, he didn't golf, he didn't work on cars. But little spare time he had, he would spend reading. And this man would read a ton. I had never met somebody who read so much and so quickly. We would take near weekly trips to half-price books. He would bring his box of books. He would trade them in for a new set of books. He would come home, and then we would do this over and over again. And mostly he read kind of the generic whodunit kind of crime novels that are a dime a dozen, but he really liked those, and he could bust them out pretty quickly. But I was probably about 12 or 13 years old when my dad said to me, he said, I think I'm going to set aside the novels for a moment, and I'm going to read the Bible cover to cover. Now, my father grew up in church. He was a faithful believer in Jesus Christ. He was involved in our church all growing up, but he, maybe like a lot of us, had just never taken the time to read the Bible cover to cover. And so my dad, they say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. My dad was what some people might call stubborn. I might not say that. Maybe like hardworking and determined is a word that I like to use. My wife says stubborn. But my father was very stubborn, and so he was going to finish the Bible. And so my dad started in Genesis 1:1, and then he started plowing through. And you know, if you have tried to read the Bible cover to cover, a lot of us get lost in Leviticus. And that's fine if you have a lot of bookmarks there in Leviticus. My dad was not going to do that. Okay, so he plowed through the Old Testament. He plowed through the New Testament, read it all cover to cover. No lie, I think it took the Joker like 2 weeks to finish the entire Bible. It was incredible. And then at the end, he finished it and he told me, and so here I was probably 12, 13 years old, and I'm like, I'm gonna have this really deep, amazing, spiritual connecting moment with my dad. And so I go to my dad and I say, Dad, teach me. Oh, Father, let me sit at your feet. Let me glean knowledge of what you have discovered from the great text of the Western civilization and all civilization. Tell me what you learned from the Bible. I'll never forget, he said, well, son, it was good. He said, I learned a lot. I'm really glad that I did it. But he said, do you want to know what my one takeaway was? I said, oh, yes, Father, impart this knowledge upon me, please. He said, well, son, I don't know much, but I do know that when John wrote Revelation, he must have been smoking something. Okay, no lie, this man just read the entire Bible, and his one takeaway was John had to be on some kind of substance when he wrote the book of Revelation. Now, we may laugh at that, but today, as we talk about the end times, I suspect that many of us might have felt that way before. That if you've read Revelation or you've kind of looked at different stuff around the end times, you see all this crazy kind of stuff. You see dragons, and you see beasts, and you see horsemen. And you see fire, and you see brimstone, and millennium, and a tribulation, and a rapture, and you're like, what is going on? This is so confusing. He must have been on something. See, what I've showed you all throughout this series is that when we talk about the afterlife, which is what we've been doing, heaven, hell, and everything in between, I hope that I've instilled in you just a little sense of wonder. A sense of mystery that while the Bible gives us clues and echoes and hints of what the future life will look like, what our lives will be like for all eternity, we get hints, we don't get the full picture. And for a lot of us, especially in the West where we like to have everything lined out, we like to understand everything, the end times can be kind of difficult. Because it's really this vacuum of knowledge that we have. We get hints, we get clues, but we don't really know a whole lot. And so because there's a mystery, because there's a vacuum, really you can go one of two ways when it comes to the end times, when it comes to the book of Revelation. First, you can become absolutely obsessed with it. Okay, this is gonna be the one thing that you learn about. This is gonna be the one thing that you master. You study all the codes and all the numbers and all the beasts, and you look at that versus the newspaper, and you try to line up each thing that Vladimir Putin does, because surely he's the Antichrist, and you try to spend all this time putting it together, and there are tons of well-meaning people on the internet, you can Google it, who do this. Okay, the end times have become an obsession for them because there's mystery surrounding it. That's option A. Option B is this, and I would guess that a lot of us are in this camp. We're like, Revelation, the end times, that stuff's kind of weird. Like, it's gonna happen, I believe in it. The Revelation, it's like kind of sci-fi, but it's also scripture, so I know I'm supposed to believe in it, but it sounds so weird that I'm just gonna kind of avoid it at all costs. Now, I've taught you this before, but there's a little preacher trick. You know this preacher trick? Preacher presents two options, and the best option is the third option that's right there in the middle. That's what we're going to do now. What I want to show you this morning is that the best option is somewhere in the middle. That we don't have to completely study and become obsessed over Revelation, and at the same time, we shouldn't neglect our knowledge of the end times, but instead having a healthy understanding of what might happen will show us how to live our lives today. Because there's so many questions surrounding the end times. What's it going to look like? What's going to happen first, and especially when's it going to happen? And you may have those questions, and guess what? Every Christian for 2,000 years has had these same questions. Jesus' disciples had these same questions. It's probably because during the time that Jesus walked the earth, the genre of apocalypse, of Armageddon, of revelation of the end times was really exploding during this period. And so there's a good chance that Jesus' disciples would have had this on the forefront of their mind, things about the end times. And so they ask him in the Gospel of Matthew about the end times. Chapter 24, we'll start in verse 8. It says that as Jesus sat on the mountain of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. And they said, "Tell us, when are these things going to be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them, "See to it that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear wars and of rumors of wars. See to it that you are not alarmed. For this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation. Kingdom will rise against kingdom. And there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All of these are but the beginning of the birth pains." So disciples come to Jesus with the same questions we might have about the end times. Hey, tell us what it's going to look like. Tell us when it's going to be. And if you've read the Bible, if you've read the words of Jesus, you know that virtually never does Jesus answer a straightforward question with a straightforward answer. And this is no exception. They're like, "Jesus, tell us when it's going to happen. What's it going to look like?" And the very first thing he says is this. He says, "See to it that no one leads you astray." Okay, this is so important. When Jesus wants us to think about the end times and what matters around them, his number one response is, see to it that no one leads you astray. Now, what he's saying here is that Jesus came and showed us how to live. He showed us what love was incarnate. And Jesus could have just come to the earth and lived and died and rose again to forgive us of our sins, but instead he also lived so that we would know how to live. And Jesus says, "I've shown you how to love the poor. I've shown you how to love everybody, including your enemy. Make sure that nobody, especially with regards to the end times, leads you astray." See, I think this principle is something that Jesus teaches with regards to what's called eschatology, which is the fancy seminary word for the theology of the end times. But I think it's true of any theology, any especially kind of minor theology that we can fixate on. See, here's what I think Jesus is teaching us here, and here's a little seminary lesson. I believe that God cares deeply about orthodoxy. Okay, orthodoxy is a big reason why we just watched this announcement from our senior leadership about leaving the United Methodist Church, because we are a church that is all about orthodoxy. Ortho means straight, and doxy means teaching. We want to make sure that we are teaching what the Bible has taught and what the church has taught for 2,000 years. Okay, that is so important to us, and it's important to God. But at the same time, God doesn't just care about what you believe in your mind. God cares about how you act. Put a different way, God doesn't just care about orthodoxy, he cares about orthopraxy. Ortho, straight, praxy, practice and doing and morality. So what Jesus is saying is, in your pursuit of orthodoxy, in your pursuit of theological purism, make sure that you don't neglect the poor. Make sure that you don't get so obsessed with the end times or of any theology that someone leads you astray from the straight and narrow of loving people. I like to think that when Jesus said this, he had the words that you've probably heard from the prophet Micah in the back of his mind. Micah 6:8, "He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?" Jesus says, make sure that nobody leads you astray from doing what I have taught you to do. Make sure that nobody comes and tries to put some theology in your mind, some eschatology in your mind that makes you go astray. Now, that may sound obscure, but follow me here. doomsday prediction is a big money-making industry, okay? Just a couple of things I saw over the past month that prove this to be true. Pastors and preachers and the news and even non-Christians have a vested interest in scaring you so much and putting up so much fear in you that you start buying their stuff. Okay, just in the past couple of months, I saw this big article about luxury doomsday bunkers. Okay, I kid you not, you can buy one about the size of this stage for I think like $100,000. These things go up to like $4 or $5 million, a huge compound underground that you can bring all your friends and all your family and survive Armageddon. Okay, and for like $4 million, this can be yours. And then I saw a very similar thing. You ever put something on TV and you fall asleep because the Aggies are losing so bad, and then you wake up a few hours later and you've stumbled upon late night infomercials? You've seen these things, right? There is now a late night infomercial from a disgraced former televangelist who is selling doomsday food buckets. Okay, $4,500, and you can get some like rice and chicken paste in there that if Jesus returns, you can be underground and eating your chicken paste. That's crazy to me. Okay, really, let's talk about this. First of all, the money, but the second of all is this. Like, if Jesus comes back, take me to glory. Like, I don't want to be 15 feet underground with 30 other people eating chicken paste. Maybe that's just me. But these are Christian companies trying to sell people on this stuff. Whereas the way I think about it is think about what $4 million could do to bless people in the names of Jesus. You give Karen Tyler $4 million, she'll change an entire country, right? Just $4,500. I'm not dogging on preppers, but you're spending that much money on food for the end times. Do you see how this pursuit of trying to guess that maybe the end is near may force us away from leading a life that God has called us to live in blessing people in his name? Jesus says the first thing to keep in mind as you think about the end times, because the end is coming, but think about this. He says, see to it that no one leads you astray. But the second thing that Jesus affirms here in his answer to his disciples is that the end is going to come one day. That there is going to be a day that we no longer experience reality in this way. Every single one of us, one thing's going to happen. We're either going to die or Jesus is going to return. Nobody gets out of this world alive. And so Jesus says, hey, there's going to be signs, there's going to be wars, there's going to be rumors of wars. He says, be on the lookout, the end is near, and here's how you can know that it's beginning to happen. He says that kingdoms are going to rise against kingdoms, there's going to be wars. He says nations are going to rise against nations. That word nation is the word ethnos in the Greek, which could also be translated as race. Races will rise against races. He says that there will be famines. He says that there will be earthquakes. There will be rumors of war. And he says, then you will know that the end is coming near. Okay, so follow me here. Let's do a little contextual reading here. Right now in our world, are kingdoms rising against kingdoms? Are nations rising against nations? Are there natural disasters? Are there people dying of famine and starvation? So, are we in the end times? In one sense, yes, we are. Okay, now let me be clear about something here. When we planned this sermon series about 8-9 months ago, Luann and I were not sitting in a room saying, you know what, I really think after the midterm elections, the end is probably gonna be near, so we need to make sure that the Loft is ready for the end, okay? This is not me saying that it is happening tomorrow. But in one sense, we are living in the end times. In fact, since Jesus ascended back into heaven 2,000 years ago, we have been living in the end times. At any moment, Jesus could inaugurate the end of all things. So you may be tempted to say, man, really based off of what's going on in the world right now, the news and Twitter and Russia and all kinds of stuff, you may be tempted to say, well, maybe the end is coming very soon. You might even be tempted to put a date on it. In fact, Christians, well-meaning Christians, have been doing this for over 2,000 years. That temptation to say, well, Jesus says there's going to be wars and rumors of wars and nations rising against nations, surely then it must be in our lifetime. Everyone who's guessed that has been wrong so far. Okay, so let's just take a look at a few of these. In the past 5 years, Professor Rodney Below said that the end times would begin on September 25th, 2022. It is now November 13th of 2022. That man was wrong. F. Kenton Bashore said that it would be 2021 at the absolute latest. Jean Dixon was convinced that Armageddon would take place in 2020. That was a slight adjustment from her original conviction that it would be February 4th of 1962. But what's a couple of years here or there? David Meade said that the world would end on September 23rd, 2015. And then he reran the numbers and he said October 15th of 2017. And then he reran the numbers again and it would be April 23rd of 2018. And then I'm sure many of us remember December 21st of 2012 that we thought the Mayans had figured it out, that they just didn't need to put a new calendar up, but the end of their calendar meant the end of the world. And then you probably remember Y2K, January 1st, 2000. We all were scared that the computers were gonna come alive and eat us all, and surely this was Armageddon. People have been predicting the end times since the beginning of time and they've all been wrong. I'm trying not to be flippant here, but we do need to poke a little fun. So I'm going to spare you from this website because I went down a rabbit hole this week in preparation for this message. There is a website that is trying to predict when the rapture is going to occur, the so-called rapture is going to occur, and they have it down to a numerical sequence where they give numbers based off of certain factors that they see in the world. You probably already knew this, but we are at a 187 of 200 on the rapture ready scale, which should terrify us, right? And so I wanted to see, what's their methodology here? How do we know if they're right or not? And so I go in and they have all these different categories of what Russia is doing, what Iran is doing, and what the healthcare industry looks like, and their level of secularization of America, and the marriage rates and the birth rates, and then my favorite of all of them were gas prices and inflation. And I'm like, guys, here's the deal. I don't think Jesus is sitting up on his throne saying as soon as the CPI hits 8.5, I'm coming down there. Like, no, Jesus is gonna come back, but we're not gonna know when. And trying to predict it is a fool's errand. Not only because people have been wrong throughout all of time, but because we have a tendency to over-exaggerate the severity of our current situation. Okay, I know that I can get you riled up and point you to all signs that right now we are living in the last days. And we could talk about all those things, inflation, and you didn't like the way the midterms went, and I could rile you up on all sorts of stuff and say, surely the end is near, but I think we need a little bit of humility. Because again, Christians from the beginning of time, from the beginning of the church have said, surely we're living in the last times. C.S. Lewis, I had to quote him in this last sermon that I'll preach on this series. C.S. Lewis was once asked about this. During his days, some 100 years ago, the atomic bomb was being invented. And there were a lot of, again, well-meaning Christians who said such an evil and massive weapon of mass destruction that can wipe out millions of people. Surely this is a sign of the end of days. And so C.S. Lewis was written to with this question. He said, how are we to live in an atomic age? Lewis said, I'm tempted to reply, why, as you would have lived in the 16th century, when the plague visited London almost every year, or as you would have lived in a Viking age when raiders from Scandinavia might land and cut your throat any night, or indeed as you are already living in an age of cancer, in an age of syphilis, in an age of paralysis, in an age of air raids, in an age of railway accidents, in an age of motor accidents. In other words, don't miss this, do not let us begin by exaggerating the novelty of our situation. Are things bad and scary right now in our world? Sure. But they always have been ever since Genesis 3. And so let's not get so caught up in trying to predict when it's going to be that we miss the mission that God has in front of us. Because Jesus, again, is pressed often about when is the end times going to be. And here's what he says in Matthew 25. He says, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and they were drinking and they were marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware of the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Did you catch that at the start? They say, when's it going to happen? And Jesus says, the angels don't know, the Son. He says, I don't even know, guys. And we could go into some really weird, interesting, obscure Trinitarian theology. I'll spare you of that. But here's the deal. Jesus says, I don't even know. So what gives us the hubris to think that we have the ability in our finite human minds to guess when the end might be? Rhetorical question, we don't. Now, before you think I'm being too flippant with the end times, let me tell you this. A doomsday prediction probably happens once, twice, 3 times a year. The news will pick it up because it's funny. Some crazy person, usually out in Florida or California, I don't know what that says about the country, but there's some prophet out there who has figured out the code from Daniel and Revelation and reading the Wall Street Journal, and they've got it all figured out. And we kind of chuckle and we watch the news report and we think that's so sweet, and then we party when we get the next day. But here's the deal. Every time I see one of those reports, I chuckle a little bit and think the hubris on that one. The second thing I do is this. I realize they could be right. We are living in the end times now. And Jesus could return tomorrow. Jesus could return tonight. Jesus could return 1,000,000 years from now. Jesus could come at any moment. So when I see these reports, I use it as a time to look in the mirror, to evaluate my own life and say, am I living a life worthy of the gospel? Am I loving God's people well to where if he were to come down from glory, he would see me as worthy? And if you hear nothing else about the end times, hear that it could be tomorrow. And so each of us need to live in such a way that we are ready. Now, some of you might have come hoping that I would talk about what this is going to look like. What are the end times going to be? Maybe you grew up in Texas, and so you heard a lot about rapture and the left behind. And I would love to know if anybody got raptured, which is where you'd show up to youth group and there'd just be a bunch of clothes on the ground to pretend like they all got away and you didn't. It was a very mean and dirty trick, but also very funny. So you may be wondering, what am I going to take a stance on when it comes to the millennium and the tribulation and the rapture and where am I? Am I a pre or a post or an ah? And where am I in all of that? And I could bore you with all of that. There would be 4 of you in this room who would find that super interesting, and we could do that offline. I'm not going to go there. Because what I believe is that we can disagree on our eschatology, on our theories of the end times. Remember, this is one of the non-essential things that is not on the final exam when we get to heaven one day. Okay, we can disagree on a whole lot of things of timeline of what it's going to look like. But what I want to close with is 3 things that we know for sure about the end days. 3 things that no matter where you line up in different eschatologies, 3 things that we could agree on and we must agree on about the end. The first one is this. I've already said it multiple times. Jesus is coming back. When that will be, I don't know. What that will look like, I'm not too sure of, but we know that Jesus is coming back, which is good news. Because it reminds us that Jesus has not forgotten you. Jesus has not forsaken you. He's at the right hand of the Father, but he has not neglected you. Jesus is coming back. The Bible, start to finish, points towards this second coming. Real quick, let's look at 5 different verses that prove this to be true. Revelation 1:7. Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And all the tribes of earth will wail on account of him. 1 Thessalonians 4:16. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God. Acts 1:11, and he said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand here looking to heaven? This Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven. Hebrews 9:28. So Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time. Not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. And the Matthew 24 we'll put on the screens. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. This is Jesus speaking. And then all the tribes of earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds and of heaven with power and with great glory. That's 5 different biblical authors, all pointing to the same singular historical event that is coming, that Jesus will return. And we know that that will be the beginning of number 2 that we can all agree on. There will be a new heavens and there will be a new earth. We talked a little bit about this in the message on heaven. I said that if you die now, you go to a place called present heaven, and then there's a future heaven where the Bible promises us that this earth will be renewed and remade. These bodies we will be reunited with, and they will be perfected. That our eternal home is not some weird, ethereal, spiritual place, but our eternal home is physical, embodied, incarnational. All that is wrong is made right. This is the vision that John describes in Revelation 21. He says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away.'" He says the end is not something to be scared of. Instead, it's the place where your heart is finally satisfied. Your body is finally satiated with no pain and no suffering and no mourning and no diseases, all completed, all renewed, all restored for all the rest of time. That's in our future. And because of that, number 3, thinking about the end times and talking about the end times should not cause us to be fearful. It should cause us to be hopeful. See, here's the thing, is that you may have opened up Revelation like my dad did and said, this is really bizarre and kind of scary sci-fi stuff. But what you got to know is that John didn't write Revelation to scare the churches. He didn't use it to beat them into submission for finally repenting of their sins. Instead, John wrote this book of Revelation to a people who were persecuted, to a people who were downcast and downtrodden, to people who were physically and spiritually and emotionally suffering. And he wrote it to them to give them great hope. To say, hey, I know that this world is difficult. I know that this place that we call earth can be painful. But he says, guess what? A new day is coming. A new day, a new age when Jesus will return and inaugurate the end of all things. And it's not something to be scared of. It's something to have great hope in. That one day we will be with him. One day we will have no pain. One day the present suffering that we experience each and every day in these physical bodies will be over. One day that is coming. We may not know when that one day is, but it could be today. And so the message of the end times is this: live as if it is. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you for this place that you've gone to prepare for us. We thank you that these sufferings of this world are only temporary. And God, I pray for the person in the room who is going through that suffering right now. God, I pray that this assurance, this reminder that Jesus is returning, that what we experience now will not be forever, will be a balm for their souls. God, I think of the woman last night that I talked to who's in the midst of grief and said, I couldn't get by it if I didn't believe in heaven. And God, we thank you that because of the truths of your word, that we do not mourn as everybody else, that we don't mourn as those without hope, but we mourn, we do, but we know that there is a hope, that you are coming back, that you are preparing a place for us. So God, help us to live our lives in such a way that if you were to return, you would find us faithful. And you would say, well done, my good and faithful servant, well done. And God, we thank you that we have that opportunity through the life, death, and resurrection of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.